The night was supposed to be silent, but in the winter of 1783, silence itself became a weapon. A Virginia estate that had stood for 3 generations, the pride of a family who believed their blood untouchable, was reduced to a tomb in a single evening. By dawn, every heir, every seed of the dynasty lay rotting in their beds. Not from the blade, not from rebellion, but from something far more precise, far more terrifying, the hand of a woman they thought they owned. Her name was Margaret Brown, and history nearly buried her story in chains of silence. Nearly. You must understand this. What happened that night was not an accident, not hysteria, not some convenient myth whispered by frightened neighbors. It was an act of calculated erasure, a ritual of justice hidden beneath the veneer of servitude. For years, she had been their shadow, feeding them, clothing them, cleaning the filth from their lives, while they believed her voiceless. But what they did not know, what the colonial record keepers worked so hard to conceal, was that Margaret had carried with her knowledge older than Virginia, older than the Atlantic crossing, knowledge they called witchcraft, but which her ancestors had named survival. When the lamps flickered in the mansion's great hall that night, no one at the table suspected that their legacy was seconds away from ending. They raised glasses, spoke of harvests, and mocked the very people whose labor fed their wealth. And in the shadows of their laughter, Margaret stood still, her hands steady, her eyes colder than the frost outside. They never saw it. They never even dreamed that the woman they considered property was, in truth, orchestrating their extinction. The official accounts, those fragments left scattered across courthouse ledgers and locked behind iron boxes in county archives, never admit the full truth. They speak of food-borne illness, of unexplained contagion, of sudden family misfortune. But the details they suppress, the testimonies they silenced, reveal something far darker, a woman who wielded knowledge like a blade and in one night erased her master's entire bloodline. The question is not how she did it. The question is, why did no one dare preserve her story? To grasp why Margaret Brown's act was so devastating, you must first understand the world she was forced into. Colonial Virginia in 1783 was a machine of control, its gears forged from tobacco profits, human bondage, and the illusion of divine right. Families like the Hawthorns, Margaret's enslavers, lived as if ordained by heaven, as if their wealth and bloodline were carved into destiny itself. But destiny can be poisoned, and Margaret knew it. The Hawthorn estate was not a home, it was a fortress of hierarchy. Red brick walls rose against the cold winds of winter, yet behind that grandeur lay cruelty disguised as order. Every routine, every breath of the enslaved was monitored. Morning bells dictated life, fields at dawn, labor until dusk, punishment swift and public. Overseers enforced discipline not merely with whips, but with something darker: psychological warfare. Enslaved families lived with the constant fear of separation, children sold without warning, mothers torn from their sons as if tearing meat from bone. This fear was deliberate, engineered to break the human spirit and bind it to obedience. But Margaret Brown did not break. She absorbed, she watched, she learned. Where others saw simple herbs, Margaret saw weapons. Where others saw kitchen duties, she saw access. She was placed at the heart of the household, the kitchen, where she touched every meal, where her hands shaped the very food that sustained the Hawthorn bloodline, and from that position of apparent servitude she built the quietest rebellion imaginable. Understand the brilliance. Power is most vulnerable at the moment it feels safest. The Hawthorns never feared a blade in the dark or an uprising in the fields. That kind of revolt they knew how to crush. What they never anticipated was betrayal within the bread, death served on silver platters beneath their chandeliered ceiling. Margaret weaponized trust itself, the invisible chain that tied master to servant. And this is why the story is so dangerous, why it was buried for centuries. It revealed that the system of control was not invincible. It showed that knowledge, the kind passed down in whispers from mother to daughter across oceans, could unravel dynasties. It was not just murder. It was the annihilation of a bloodline through an act of precision rebellion, cloaked as obedience. This is the truth they never wanted you to hear. Margaret Brown had not always been silent. She came from a lineage that carried memory like a weapon, memory encoded in song, in rhythm, in knowledge of roots and leaves. Before chains tore her from her homeland, she was a daughter of a people who understood that survival meant more than breath. It meant keeping the old sciences hidden beneath the eye of the oppressor. In Africa, they had called it medicine. In Virginia, it was branded sorcery. To the enslavers, anything they could not control was declared evil. Margaret arrived in the colonies young, too young to bear the weight of the ocean's middle passage, yet even in youth she carried fragments, plants that burned, seeds that healed, and rituals that preserved dignity in the face of bondage. While others forgot under the terror of whips, she remembered. Every herb she handled in the kitchen was another reminder of power they could not erase. They thought they had stripped her of identity. Instead, they had given her access. By the 1780s, the Hawthorne family believed themselves untouchable. They had weathered the Revolutionary War, profited from tobacco, and secured marriages that tied them to Virginia's political elite. Their estate echoed with self-assurance, imported glass, carved mahogany, portraits painted in England to declare their permanence. But permanence is an illusion. Beneath their polished dining tables lay rot. Their cruelty was not hidden, it was paraded. Margaret endured the lashings, the humiliations, the twisted rituals of dominance inflicted by men who mistook brutality for nobility, and yet she endured not as a victim, but as a strategist, waiting for the perfect hour. That hour came when desperation met arrogance. Debt loomed over the Hawthorns after poor harvests, and whispers of selling more enslaved families spread through the quarters like sickness. Margaret listened. She knew what was coming. The destruction of bonds, the scattering of lives. She had already seen too many mothers broken, too many fathers vanish at auction blocks, and then she made a decision that would echo like thunder across centuries. She would not wait for them to break her people again. She would strike first. The Hawthorns thought they were gathering for a feast of celebration. What they did not realize was that the feast had been prepared as their funeral. The night itself was a theater. Cold winds lashed against the windows of the Hawthorne estate, rattling panes like a warning no one dared hear. Inside, the great dining hall shimmered with candlelight, silver goblets catching the glow like fragments of fire. The family gathered in confidence, voices loud, laughter hollow, arrogance dripping from every word. They were blind to the storm brewing not outside, but at their own table. Margaret moved among them with precision. To them she was invisible, another shadow serving their needs, another hand filling their cups. But invisibility is the greatest cloak of power. With every dish she set down, with every subtle adjustment of flavor, she was tightening a noose around an entire bloodline. The roasted meats, the stews, the puddings, all bore her hand, and within them lay the quiet signature of her rebellion. The poison was not crude, it was not poured with recklessness. No, Margaret's hand was guided by knowledge sharpened across centuries. The plant she chose had dual natures, healers when measured carefully, executioners when summoned in strength. What appeared as seasoning was something else entirely, and its effect would be irreversible. The brilliance of her method was this. The symptoms would not strike immediately. The family would first feast, would first toast to their imagined glory, would first believe themselves immortal, and only then, when their guard was lowest, would the shadow of death curl inside them. One by one, the Hawthorns raised their forks, unaware they were consuming their extinction. Edmund Hawthorne, patriarch of the estate, laughed louder than the rest, his arrogance filling the hall like smoke. His wife, Elizabeth, prattled about alliances, about marriages that would carry their name further into Virginia's aristocracy. Their children, heirs to a stolen empire, drank deeply, their lips styed, Ned, with the very substance that would erase them from history. And through it all, Margaret stood silent, watching, waiting, not with vengeance burning visibly in her face, but with the stillness of someone who has already buried her fear, already accepted the weight of destiny. That night was no accident. It was ritual, and rituals once begun cannot be undone. The candles flickered as the family feasted, but the shadows on the wall told another story, the shadows of a dynasty already dying, though they did not yet know it. At first it was nothing, just the laughter of a family bloated with their own power, the clinking of goblets echoing like false hymns in the great hall. But then, as the fire snapped in the hearth, silence crept in, subtle at first. A cough from the youngest son, a tightening of the matriarch's throat, a flicker of discomfort that no one wanted to acknowledge. The Hawthorns had always dismissed weakness as shame, so they disguised their unease behind nervous smiles. But Margaret knew this was the opening act. The symptoms spread like ripples across a still pond. Edmund's booming voice faltered, his words slurred as if heavy chains dragged them down. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she reached for her wine, unaware her lips were already darkening. The eldest daughter's face turned pale, her refined posture collapsing into a crude hunch as her stomach twisted in revolt. They looked at one another with confusion, then with suspicion, then with fear, and in that moment their empire cracked. The poison was not merciful. It did not strike them dead in silence. It forced them to witness each other's unraveling. Tongues blackened, veins burned with invisible fire. A strange sweetness lingered on their breath, laced with bitterness that made even the air taste corrupted. Some clawed at their throats, gasping for breath that would not come. Others convulsed violently, their bodies betraying them in grotesque spasms that mocked their aristocratic dignity. Margaret did not flinch. She stood in the shadows of the hall, her expression unreadable. She had seen the lash tear flesh, seen children ripped from mothers' arms, seen cruelty paraded as order. Now the cruelty had turned inward, devouring the very family that had feasted on suffering for generations. What the overseers had called obedience, Margaret revealed as patience. And patience, when sharpened, becomes execution. The Hawthorns, who believed themselves untouchable, now collapsed across their own table, faces pressed into the very plates that carried their ruin. Their moans echoed through the hall like a funeral dirge no priest could sanctify. Within minutes, the family line that had survived wars, debts, and rivalries was no more than a trembling mass of bodies writhing towards silence. And in that silence, one truth remained. Margaret Brown had not simply killed. She had erased. Morning light revealed the massacre not as chaos, but as order, the kind of order only vengeance can shape. The grand hall of the Hawthorn estate, once polished with servants' labor, had become a mausoleum. The fire still smoldered, casting its weak glow over twisted limbs and overturned goblets. Their portraits, those painted visages meant to preserve their eternal dignity, now stared down at the ruined bodies below, as if bearing witness to the end of their own myth. No cries had escaped the night. Margaret had ensured that. The overseers and house servants, bound by fear and secrecy, had heard muffled sounds but dared not investigate. To enter that hall was to risk becoming part of its history. So they stayed away, listening as the empire crumbled only rooms away. When dawn broke, whispers spread like smoke, quiet, frantic, disbelieving. The Hawthorns were dead, all of them. The slaves, those whom the family had treated as cattle, gathered cautiously, their faces tight with both terror and awe. Some crossed themselves, others whispered prayers in tongues their captors had tried to erase. They had seen death before, but never like this. Death had always come for them, never for the masters. And now, in one night, the balance had shifted. A question hung in the air, heavier than the stench of poison. Was this justice, or was it damnation? Margaret stood apart, not triumphant, not broken. She carried no joy in what she had done. Vengeance is rarely clean. She knew the punishment would not end with the Hawthorns. The world outside the estate would demand explanations, and explanations always demanded blood. The slaves feared that their temporary freedom would soon turn to massacre when the surrounding plantations learned what had happened. But Margaret was not afraid. Her act had not been one of impulse. It had been calculation, ritual even. She had not merely ended a family. She had set into motion something larger, something the world was not prepared to name. For in the South, where whispers traveled faster than light, stories began to spread of a woman who had poisoned her masters in a single night, of an enslaved hand that struck back at the very heart of power. Some called her a witch, others a demon, but those who knew suffering called her something else: deliverance. And yet, history has a way of twisting deliverance into fear. The news spread like wildfire, faster than any horse could gallop. By midday, riders carried whispers from the Hawthorne estate to neighboring plantations, then further still to Richmond. A family of stature, a lineage tied to the Revolution itself, had been wiped out in a single night. No robbery, no signs of an outside attack. Only silence, only poison. And at the center of every retelling, one name emerged again and again: Margaret. The community's reaction was immediate and divided. To the enslaved, she was a figure of awe, proof that the chains could break, that even the untouchables could fall. Quiet songs hummed in the quarters, coded words passed between the fields, stories of the woman who had turned her knowledge of roots and herbs into a weapon. To them, she was not simply a servant, she was a prophet of vengeance. But to the white families of Virginia, the Hawthorne massacre was a nightmare realized. If one enslaved woman could destroy a dynasty, then no household was safe. Panic swelled. Every herb in the kitchen became suspect. Every drink tasted twice before swallowed. Wives whispered to husbands at night, "What if ours do the same?" Fear wrapped itself around every dining table, every glass of wine, every bowl of stew. The Hawthornes' deaths were not just a tragedy, they were a warning. Authorities descended upon the estate. What they found only deepened the dread. Margaret had not fled. She stood in the ruins of the hall when they arrived, calm, composed, as if awaiting judgment. She did not beg. She did not cry. She told them nothing. Her silence terrified them more than any confession could have. They could not decide whether she was guilty of murder, witchcraft, or something darker. But they knew one thing: she had to be made into an example. So the decision was swift. Margaret was chained, paraded through the county as both criminal and omen. Chillum. Dren pointed, mothers clutched their sons tighter, and men spat curses as she passed. Yet in the shadows the enslaved watched with a different gaze, eyes wide, hearts pounding. They saw not defeat, but legend being born. Margaret Brown was no longer just a woman. She was the ghost that haunted Virginia's dining tables, the whisper that made every master tremble before his supper. But legends, once birthed, refused to stay buried. The courthouse in Richmond was swollen with bodies the morning of Margaret's trial. Men crammed the aisles, women fanned themselves nervously, and children clung to skirts, their wide eyes drinking in the sight of a woman accused of something too monstrous to name aloud. They had come not for justice, but for spectacle. Trials in that era were theatre, and Margaret Brown was the leading act. The charges against her were contradictory, almost incoherent. Some claimed she had poisoned the Hawthornes with herbs. Others swore she had whispered incantations that made the family choke on their own breath. Still others muttered that she had consorted with spirits, that shadows moved at her command. It did not matter what was true. What mattered was that every whisper reinforced the terror already tightening its grip on Virginia's ruling class. Margaret was brought before them in chains, yet she did not look broken. Her posture remained upright, her face unreadable. When the judge demanded she speak, she said nothing. When the prosecutor thundered accusations, she offered no defense. The silence was unbearable. In that silence, the gallery heard more than words. They heard defiance, they heard refusal, they heard the one thing they could never control. Witnesses came forward. A servant who claimed Margaret muttered to plants in the kitchen, a neighbor who insisted he had seen strange lights in the woods near the estate, even a priest who declared that evil had walked in her presence. Each testimony blurred the line between law and superstition until the trial felt less like judgment and more like ritual. Margaret was not being tried for murder. She was being tried for daring to wield knowledge that was never meant for her to keep. By the third day, the verdict was inevitable. Guilty, not of a crime that could be proven, but of being feared. The sentence was death. Yet when the judge read it aloud, Margaret finally moved. A smile crept across her lips, not wide, not mocking, but knowing, as if she understood that the rope they prepared for her neck would not silence her name. It would spread it. The gallery shuddered. Mothers pulled children close, because in that instant they all realized something chilling. The Hawthorns may have died at their table, but it was their entire class that Margaret Brown had poisoned. The gallows rose at dawn, a crude scaffold of splintered wood erected in the town square. Executions were meant to be lessons, warnings etched into flesh and bone for the enslaved to witness. But on that morning in 1787, the lesson turned inward. The white elite gathered in hushed anticipation, whispering prayers that Margaret Brown's death would end their fear. The enslaved stood further back, forced to watch, yet their eyes carried a quiet fire of their own. Margaret was led to the platform, chains clinking with each step. Her body bore the scars of whips, the bruises of restraint, but her face was calm, unyielding. The hangman avoided her gaze, fumbling with the rope as if touching her sealed his own fate. The priest stepped forward, reciting holy words, urging her to repent. She did not kneel, she did not speak. Only when the final words of condemnation echoed across the square did she lift her head to the crowd. Her voice rang out clear, sharp as iron. "You think my body ends me, but you will carry me in your blood, you and every child after you." A ripple tore through the audience. Some laughed nervously, others crossed themselves, but many felt it, that invisible weight pressing against their chests as if she had already reached inside them. The hangman tightened the rope, the lever was pulled, and Margaret fell. The crowd expected silence. Instead, they swore they heard it, the sound of breath that was not hers, a whisper threaded through the wind. Some claimed her shadow did not swing with her body, that it lingered against the wood long after the rope ceased to move. Others whispered that when the priest closed her eyes, they snapped open once more before settling in stillness. The town dispersed with trembling feet, yet no one left cleansed. Children cried in their sleep for weeks. Livestock sickened without reason. And within the year, the Hawthorns' surviving relatives began to die in strange, violent ways. Illnesses without cause, accidents without explanation, madness without cure. The curse was not a rumor. It was a bloodline disease, stitched into their lineage by a woman they believed they had destroyed. Margaret Brown was gone, but she had not died. She had multiplied. The Hawthorns believed wealth could shield them. They had endured Margaret's execution and returned to their estate with a sense of finality, certain that terror had been buried with her body. But curses are not buried, they germinate. By the winter of 1788, cracks began to appear, subtle at first, then catastrophic. The youngest Hawthorn son, Elias, was the first. He was only 12, a boy born into privilege, never knowing hunger or hardship. But something began to unravel in him. He complained of voices at night, whispers that called his name from the corners of his room. Servants found him sitting upright in bed, eyes open, speaking in a language none recognized. Physicians bled him, priests prayed over him, yet nothing silenced the shadows that grew in his mind. Within months, his body withered, and one night he was found at the edge of the property, his neck broken, his face twisted in terror. The family called it tragedy, the townsfolk called it judgment. Then came Eleanor, the eldest daughter. She was 19, set to marry a merchant whose fortune would merge with the Hawthorns. But her nights were plagued with dreams of fire, of a woman's face with eyes like burning coals. At first she tried to hide it, dismissing it as imagination. But soon the dreams bled into waking hours. She began to speak of Margaret by name, though she had been only a child at the time of the execution. One evening, at a gathering meant to announce her engagement, she collapsed before the guests, convulsing, clawing at her throat as though invisible hands gripped her. When she finally stilled, her eyes stared upward, glassy and wide, and her final words were heard by all present. "She is not gone." By the second death, no one doubted. Margaret's curse was real. The Hawthorns tried everything to smother it. They brought in priests to sanctify the estate, herbalists to cleanse the air, and even paid travelers who claimed to know rites older than Christianity. Yet nothing stemmed the decay. Crops failed, cattle miscarried, and servants fled under cover of night. The family who once ruled with cruelty now lived in dread, barricaded within their own mansion. The curse was not loud, not constant. It was patient, surgical. It waited, selecting each victim with precision. And it carried one unshakable message. Margaret Brown had not been silenced. She was still speaking through their blood. Grief turned to fear, and fear to obsession. By 1790, the Hawthorne estate resembled less a home and more a fortress under siege, not by armies, but by something unseen. The remaining family members grew gaunt, sleepless and paranoid. Whispers spread through Massachusetts. The Hawthornes are marked. The witch takes her vengeance still. But inside those crumbling walls, the Hawthornes were not resigned to destruction. They began to seek answers in places most men dared not look. Jonathan Hawthorne, the patriarch, was the first to act. He scoured old libraries and ports for texts the church had forbidden. He paid sailors to bring him books from Europe, volumes bound in cracked leather, their pages filled with symbols that twisted the eyes. Some spoke of charms against curses, others of rituals to bind the dead. He read late into the night, candles burning low, ink staining his hands as he copied strange diagrams onto scraps of parchment. His eldest surviving son, Nathaniel, went further still. He sought out men rumored to be alchemists and even met in secret with a former priest defrocked for heresy. From them, he learned that Margaret's curse was not mere vengeance, it was a tether. Her soul, wronged and broken, had anchored itself to the Hawthorne bloodline, feeding on their pride, their cruelty, their denial. To sever such a bond, they would need to invoke forces just as dark as those that sustained it. But every attempt failed. They buried charms in the soil, they burned effigies made from her likeness, they recited prayers not meant for human tongues, and with each attempt the curse seemed to tighten its grip. In 1791, the curse claimed another victim, this time Jonathan's wife Catherine. She was found one morning in the orchard, her body suspended from an oak tree by her own hair, though no one could explain how it had been done. Her face bore no wounds, no struggle, only a look of quiet horror frozen in death. The family buried her quickly without ceremony, as though fearing that even grief might summon Margaret's laughter. After Catherine's death, Jonathan's obsession deepened. He began to believe there was only one way to end the torment, not by resisting Margaret's curse, but by confronting her. If her soul had anchored itself to the family, then he must find a way to call it forth, to speak with it directly. And so, in secret, the Hawthornes began to prepare for something no family should ever attempt, a summoning. The air inside Hawthorne Manor grew heavier with each passing night. By the spring of 1792, Jonathan's journals spoke no longer of prayer or protection, but of direct confrontation. He had convinced his surviving children that the only path forward was to face Margaret Hawthorne herself, no matter the cost. They chose the night of a new moon, when the skies were black and silent. The family gathered in the cellar, a place where the air never moved, where the stone walls seemed to drink in sound. Upon the floor, Jonathan had carved a circle, etched with markings copied from half a dozen forbidden texts. Strange herbs were burned in an iron basin, their smoke clinging to the skin like oil. At the center of the circle sat a chair, empty, waiting. Nathaniel read from a book so old its pages crumbled beneath his fingers. The words were not in English, nor in Latin, but in some older tongue that tasted bitter on the lips. Their younger sister, Elizabeth, trembled as she held a candle, her knuckles white. "We should not do this," she whispered. "We should let her rest." But Jonathan silenced her with a glare. "She will not rest until she is answered." As the chant rose, the air turned colder. The candle flames bent inward, as though drawn towards something unseen. A low hum began to vibrate through the stones beneath their feet, and the smell of iron, like fresh blood, filled the room. Then it came. A voice. Not a scream, not a whisper, but something that pressed into their skulls without sound. "You call me." Yet you never listened when I cried." The voice was Margaret's. Elizabeth dropped her candle and the flames snuffed out in the smoke. Nathaniel froze, unable to continue the incantation. But Jonathan pressed forward, his voice trembling yet commanding, "Margaret, release my bloodline. Release this curse." A laughter filled the cellar, brittle and sharp. "Release? You took everything from me. My breath, my dignity, my rest. And now you ask, release." The chair at the center of the circle groaned as though a weight had settled upon it. In the shadows, the outline of a woman began to take form, her hair unbound, her neck scarred, her eyes burning with a grief that had curdled into rage. "Your children will carry me. Your children's children will carry me, until your name is Ash." The circle Jonathan had carved cracked under the strain. The markings bled into one another like veins of fire. The summoning had not bound Margaret. It had freed her. The cellar door slammed shut. Every candle went dark. And in the suffocating blackness, the Hawthorns realized too late that they had not called Margaret into the circle. They had opened their home to her. When dawn finally broke, the cellar was silent. The family stumbled out one by one, pale and hollow-eyed, as if the night had aged them by decades. The circle Jonathan had carved was gone, nothing but scorched stone and the faint stench of smoke. Of Margaret herself there was no trace, but her presence lingered in the walls, in the air, in the marrow of their bones. From that night onward, the manor seemed alive. Doors opened when no one touched them. Portraits wept black streaks down their gilded frames. Elizabeth swore she heard someone humming lullabies in her chamber each night, the same lullabies Margaret had once sung to her own children before the fever took them. Nathaniel, the strongest of the siblings, began to waste away, his skin sallow, his eyes sunken. He claimed he felt something gnawing inside him, a shadow that fed whenever he closed his eyes. Jonathan tried to hide it from the townspeople, but rumors spread quickly. Servants fled the estate, whispering of ghostly hands that dragged them by the hair, of laughter echoing through empty halls. Even the livestock sickened and died, as if the soil itself had soured beneath Margaret's curse. Still, Jonathan clung to his pride. "We are Hawthorns," he declared, his voice cracking with desperation. "No witch, no spirit can undo us." But his children no longer believed him. Elizabeth begged him to leave the manor, to burn it if he must. Nathaniel urged retreat to the city, away from the soil Margaret had claimed. Yet Jonathan's obsession only deepened. By midsummer, Margaret no longer confined herself to whispers and shadows. She appeared in mirrors, her reflection overlaying their own. She sat at the dining table when the family gathered, her scarred throat exposed, her eyes fixed on Jonathan. She spoke in riddles, half curses, half prophecies, always reminding them that what they saw was not a haunting but an inheritance. One night, Elizabeth awoke to find Margaret standing over her bed, holding something in her withered hands. It was a cradle, empty, rocking back and forth in silence. When Elizabeth screamed, Jonathan rushed in but saw nothing, only his daughter, trembling and hysterical, insisting that Margaret had promised her child, unborn, unimagined, would belong to her. The Hawthorns realized then that the curse was not simply punishment for Margaret's death. It was a contract, sealed in blood and bone, stretching into generations unborn. And the more Jonathan resisted, the more violently Margaret pressed her claim. The family was no longer merely haunted. They were possessed by their own history. By late summer, it was no longer only the Hawthorn family who suffered. The town itself began to whisper Margaret's name as though it had returned to life. Children fell ill with fevers that doctors could not explain. Livestock miscarried in the fields. Crops withered overnight, entire acres turning black as if fire had passed through, though no smoke had ever been seen. The townspeople blamed the Hawthorns. They had always been set apart, wealthy landowners who wielded more power than the mayor, who kept their distance from church gatherings, who never mixed with the common folk except to collect rents. And now, with the strange happenings, suspicion turned to certainty. "The family has brought her back," one woman whispered at the market. "They tried to silence her once, and now she silences us all. Jonathan fought to keep control. He paid off the preacher to assure the congregation that no curse lingered over the land. He distributed food from the hawthorn stores when the harvest failed, presenting himself as a benefactor rather than a blight. But the people saw through it. They saw the hollow-eyed children at the manor gates. They heard Elizabeth crying in the night. They smelled the rot that seemed to seep from the hawthorn wells. And sometimes, just sometimes, they saw her. Margaret. She appeared on the outskirts of the town, standing in the fields at dusk, her figure swaying in the tall grass. Some swore they saw her in the churchyard, lingering at the graves of those who had recently died, her charred throat shimmering as though still aflame. A hunter claimed she had walked straight through his horse, sending the beast screaming into the woods. Few dared to say these things aloud, but all felt them. Margaret was no longer confined to hawthorn stone. She had taken root in the soil itself. Jonathan responded the only way he knew how, with defiance. He urged the family's men to patrol the fields, to drive off any who came too close to the estate. He barred the doors of the manor, locking his children inside like prisoners. "It is our blood she wants," he hissed, "and our blood she shall not have." But the truth gnawed at the edges of his mind. Every effort he made to resist only seemed to strengthen her. His refusal to submit was fuel for her vengeance. Margaret had been born of fire, and fire grows when fed by pride. By autumn, the hawthorns were not just feared, they were despised. And Margaret had achieved what she could not in life. She had turned an entire town against its own masters. Jonathan Hawthorne had never believed in curses. He believed in power, in control, in the strength of will that separated his family from the rabble outside their gates. But now, with Margaret's presence seeping into every shadow, he could no longer deny it. She was not a memory. She was not madness. She was here. One night, under the weight of sleepless hours, Jonathan crept into the manor's sealed library. It was a room his ancestors had forbidden entry to for decades, its heavy oak doors locked with iron. But Jonathan broke the lock himself. He had heard whispers from his father, tales of the black volumes hidden there, books never meant to be touched, bound in strange leather, written in languages no pastor could bless. By candlelight, he found them. Dusty tomes covered in glyphs, diagrams of circles, instructions for bargaining with the unseen. They were not prayers. They were not invocations of God. They were commands, written by men who had stared too long into the abyss. And Jonathan, desperate to reclaim control, read them. The ritual was simple in words, but horrifying in practice. To bind a restless soul, one must speak its name in fire and blood, standing upon the very earth where it had been condemned. That meant the field, the place where Margaret had burned. Jonathan prepared with a soldier's precision. He took a knife from the family armory, a silver bowl, and the blood of his own hound, slain without hesitation. At midnight he walked alone to the field. The earth was damp, though no rain had fallen. The air smelled of smoke, though no fire burned. He drew the circle as instructed, cutting his palm and letting the blood drip into the soil. His voice shook only once as he spoke her name. "Margaret Hawthorne. I bind you to silence. I bind you to ash. You will trouble this world no more." At first, nothing, only silence. Then the ground beneath him, too, rumbled. Faint at first, then harder, like something clawing upward from below. His candlelight flickered out, though no wind blew, and from the dark earth, a voice, raw, wet, and burning, answered him. "You cannot bind what you created." The soil split. Smoke poured upward. A hand, blackened, brittle and charred, broke through the dirt and reached for him. Jonathan stumbled backward, his circle broken, the ritual undone. And there, rising from the place of her death, Margaret appeared. Not a ghost, not a memory, but something between flesh and flame. Her ruined throat twisted into what might once have been a smile. "You gave me fire," she whispered, her voice like cracking timber. "Now I will give it back." Jonathan realized too late that the ritual had not bound her, it had summoned her. Jonathan fled the field with a terror he had never known. His boots sank in the wet earth as he stumbled toward the manor, clutching the knife still slick with blood. Behind him, footsteps followed, slow, deliberate, echoing louder than his own. He dared not look back. The fire he had called was walking with him. The Hawthorne Manor loomed in the night like a fortress against the world, its windows burning with the faint glow of candlelight. Jonathan burst through the heavy front doors, slamming them shut with a force that rattled the chandeliers. His chest heaved and his hand bled freely onto the marble floor, leaving a trail the house would never forget. "Father!" he shouted, though his father was long buried. "Mother! Elizabeth!" His voice cracked. Silence answered, and then the air shifted. The manor itself seemed to groan. Its timbers stretched and snapped as if something pressed against them from outside. Portraits lining the hall shook upon the walls. The painted eyes of Hawthorne ancestors, once regal and commanding, now appeared wide with terror. The smell of smoke seeped through the cracks of the doors and windows, though no fire had been set. Jonathan drew his father's pistol from a drawer in the entrance hall. His hand trembled as he aimed it toward the doors. But when they creaked open, it was not intruders that entered. It was the blackened mist of Margaret's presence, drifting inside as if the house itself invited her. She stepped forward, her burned skin glowing faintly, her hair like strands of soot and ember. Her eyes no longer held color. They were pits of molten shadow, and they fixed themselves on Jonathan with a hunger deeper than hatred. "You think these walls protect you?" she hissed, her words scraping like ash in the throat. "Do you not remember, Jonathan? This house was mine before it was yours. I bled in its halls. I burned on its lance. Every stone belongs to me now." The pistol shook in Jonathan's grip. He fired. The blast echoed through the halls, the smoke stinging his eyes, but Margaret did not fall. The bullet passed through her, hitting the wall behind with a crack. The portrait of his great-grandfather split down the middle, canvas tearing like flesh. Margaret's charred hand rose, and with it the flames of the hearth roared alive, spilling fire across the rugs and tapestries. Curtains ignited, staircases caught, and soon the house itself seemed to scream with her fury. Jonathan staggered backward, cornered by both flame and spirit. "What do you want from me?" he cried, his voice breaking with fear. Her face twisted into something almost human, almost tender, though the fire licked her teeth as she spoke. "What I was denied," she whispered. "Justice. And you, Jonathan, you will burn first." The flames surged forward, rushing toward him as though alive. The Hawthorne air had become the sacrifice, and the house itself seemed eager to consume him. The fire spread with unnatural speed, racing up the carved staircase, curling around the banisters, and devouring the portraits of the Hawthorne line. The faces of stern patriarchs melted into grotesque smears, their once proud eyes dripping down the canvas like tears of molten tar. The house groaned as if in pain, each beam straining, each wall trembling. Jonathan stumbled back, choking on the smoke that filled the air. His eyes watered, but even through the haze he could see it. The manor itself was no longer just a house. It was alive, breathing, and every breath was fire. "Do you feel it?" Margaret's voice echoed not only from her mouth, but from the very walls, the floors, the ceilings. "This house remembers every scream, every secret, every sin buried within its bones, and now it remembers me." The chandelier in the grand hall swayed wildly before crashing down, shattering into 1,000 sparks that lit the velvet drapes. The marble floor beneath Jonathan cracked open in jagged lines, flames licking up from the depths as though the earth itself had joined her vengeance. Jonathan pressed himself against the wall, pistol clattering from his trembling hands. "No, no, no," he muttered, his voice breaking into sobs. "This isn't real. You're dead. You're nothing but—" Before he could finish, the wooden panels of the hallway shifted, warping as if made of flesh. Dark, burned handprints spread across the walls, pressing outward from within. Fingers clawed through the wallpaper, nails scratching deep grooves that bled black resin. Margaret's figure moved closer, each step causing the flames to bow toward her like subjects before a queen. Her charred gown dragged embers across the floor, leaving smoldering scars in the carpet. Jonathan tried to run. He darted toward the library, slamming the heavy oak door shut behind him. He pressed his back against it, panting, aching, desperate to believe he was safe. But the books began to stir. Pages fluttered though no wind touched them. The shelves trembled, spilling tomes onto the floor. From the cracks between the spines, smoke seeped, curling into the shape of words. Her words. Justice, justice, justice. The chant built into a chorus, each book groaning the word in Margaret's voice until the sound filled every corner of the room. Jonathan clutched his ears, screaming. And then, silence. He opened his eyes. Across the room in the flickering firelight stood Margaret. No longer behind him, no longer outside. She was there, waiting, her blackened smile splitting wide. "You cannot run from a house that has already chosen its master," she whispered. The manor shuddered violently, dust falling from the ceiling. Jonathan realized in that moment of choking dread that Hawthorne Manor was no longer his inheritance, it was her throne. The floor beneath Jonathan lurched, sending him sprawling to his knees. The great library groaned, as if its wooden ribs were being twisted from the inside. Dust and plaster rained down, books tumbled from the shelves, and the very air thickened with ash. He scrambled to the door, yanking at the brass handle with desperate force. It did not budge. He kicked it, slammed his fists against it, screamed until his throat tore, but the door no longer opened to the hall. Instead, the wood softened beneath his touch, pulsing faintly, warm like flesh. He recoiled in horror as veins, black and snaking, spread across it, sealing him inside. The manor had decided. There would be no escape. Margaret stepped forward, her charred hand grazing along the spines of the fallen books. Each one ignited at her touch, curling into ash until the room was lit only by the fire and her hollow eyes. "You were never heir to this house," she said softly, her voice both intimate and damning. "You were its jailer, and now you will share its sentence." Jonathan staggered back, pressing against the far wall. "You're mad. You're dead. You don't own this place. I do." His voice cracked, collapsing under his own terror. Margaret's laugh slithered through the air. "You mistake ownership for dominion. You signed your name on parchment, yes. But my blood, my suffering, my bones, those were written in the very foundations. This manor has always been mine. It only ever tolerated you." The wallpaper behind Jonathan writhed, the floral patterns blackening into skulls that grinned at him. The shelves swelled outward, the wood splintering like ribs cracking under immense pressure. And then, slowly, inexorably, the walls began to close in. He screamed, throwing himself against them, pounding his fists until they bled, but the room shrank, inch by inch, the ceiling dropping lower, the walls pressing tighter. The library was becoming a coffin. Margaret raised her arm, and with it the fire obeyed. It surged along the floorboards, circling Jonathan like a hungry beast, hemming him in. His eyes darted wildly, seeking escape, but the only thing left was her face, blackened, smiling, merciless. "You will burn, Jonathan," she whispered, "as I burned. You will choke as I choked, and only when the last of your flesh is ash will this house sleep again." The flames leapt higher, and the walls groaned shut. Jonathan's scream tore through the manor, but outside, only the crackle of fire answered. The scream that tore from Jonathan's throat was swallowed whole by the house, not muffled, not echoed, swallowed, as if the air itself refused to carry his name any longer. The fire seared his flesh, but worse than the agony of flame was the sensation that followed, the unraveling of self. At first it was subtle. The family portraits that lined the wall above the staircase, the ones he had spent hours studying to prove his claim, shifted in the heat. The painted Jonathan faded, his figure dissolving into the backdrop, leaving only strangers in heavy coats staring outward. His likeness no longer existed. In the manor's records room, tucked deep in its stone belly, ancient ledgers of the Hawthorne bloodline smoldered without fire. The ink of his name bled across the pages, letters smearing into nothingness until the parchment read as though Jonathan had never been born. Even beyond the manor, the curse reached outward. In the village where townsfolk whispered his name, their memories fractured like brittle glass. They frowned, puzzled, as if recalling a dream half-remembered. "Jonathan? Who?" they murmured, then shook their heads as though the thought had never existed. Inside the collapsing library, Jonathan clawed at the walls, his fingernails ripping free, leaving streaks of blood that the manor drank eagerly. His voice was hoarse, no longer shouting but begging, pleading with the walls, with Margaret, with whatever would hear him. "Please," he rasped, falling to his knees. "Don't take me away. I was here. Margaret stood above him, flames framing her figure like the halo of a damned saint, her blackened lips curved into something crueler than pity. "You were nothing but a shadow passing through a house of blood. Shadows do not leave records. Shadows do not endure." The floor quaked, and the boards beneath Jonathan split wide. Darkness yawned below, deeper than any fire, deeper than earth itself. A pit with no end, no bottom. The heat of hell and the chill of the grave bled upward together, devouring the room. Jonathan's hands scrambled at the ground, desperate for purchase, but the wood beneath him softened into ash, and his body dropped. His scream tore free one last time, yet this time not even the manor heard it. Where his body had been, nothing remained. No trace, no memory, only firelight flickering across the shelves. Margaret turned her face toward the silence. "Now," she whispered, "the house is cleansed." Outside, the night split open with fire. From the hills above the village, Hawthorne Manor glowed like a beacon of damnation, its silhouette wrapped in flames that burned not orange but a deep, furious red. The villagers gathered in the square, their faces pale, their voices hushed, as though some forbidden bell had tolled in the marrow of their bones. For years they had whispered of the manor's curse, its walls groaning at midnight, its windows flickering with lights when no one lived there. They had crossed themselves, prayed in silence, and avoided the path that led to its iron gates. Yet now the house had come alive in the most terrible way, blazing against the black horizon, as if the earth itself rejected it. "God preserve us," an old woman muttered, clutching her rosary. But the words fell flat, lifeless, for even the heavens seemed to look away. Then came the screams, not from the flames, but from the earth itself. The villagers froze, their blood running cold as a deep guttural wail rolled down from the manor, carrying through the valley like the cry of something being unmade. Some swore they heard a man's voice, ragged, begging, but when they turned to one another, each shook their heads in fear. No man had ever lived long enough to fight the Hawthorne bloodline. Children wept, pulling at their mothers' skirts. Men tightened their grips on lanterns and pitchforks, but none dared move closer. The heat rolled across the fields, oppressive, unnatural, carrying with it the stink of burning parchment and charred flesh. Yet beneath the fire's roar, something more chilling pressed into their minds. Silence, as if names, faces, and memories had been torn from them mid-breath. "Who lived there?" one farmer asked aloud, his brow furrowing. "Whose kin was it?" The crowd fell still. They tried to answer, to summon the name that had lingered in their gossip for Monty, Tess, but their tongues faltered. The memory was gone, stolen clean. Only the image of Margaret Hawthorne remained, her legend burned too deep into the land to be erased. A boy pointed to the manor and whispered, "She's still inside." And in that moment, as the flames consumed the last of the roof, the villagers saw her. Margaret stood at the highest window, wreathed in fire, her silhouette calm, defiant, unburned. Her gaze swept down upon them like judgment, and though the glass shattered around her, not a spark dared touch her skin. The villagers fell to their knees, trembling, for they understood in that terrible instant that Hawthorne Manor was not dying, it was being reborn. The villagers thought the blaze would devour the manor and then die, leaving only blackened stone and ash, But the fire did not behave like fire. It did not flicker with hunger and fade with exhaustion. It grew. It surged outward, racing across the fields as though roots long buried had caught flame. The air shimmered with heat, and yet no wind carried the smoke. It rose in columns, dark and heavy, straight into the heavens, as if the night sky itself had been pierced. Men ran to the well, throwing buckets of water onto hay bales and fences, but the water hissed into steam before it even touched the flames. Women herded their children into the chapel, believing the sanctuary would protect them, but already the old oak doors trembled, the iron hinges groaning under an unseen pressure. "Not a fire," one man whispered hoarsely. "It's her." Margaret's image at the window had vanished, but her presence did not. The flames carried her will, spreading with the certainty of judgment. Crops blackened in an instant, livestock collapsed in the fields, their bodies stiff and lifeless before the flames reached them. The earth itself seemed to reject life. The mayor, a man who had long mocked the tales of hawthorn blood, climbed atop a wagon and shouted above the chaos, "Do not run. If we scatter, we are lost. Stay together. Stand firm." But his words faltered as the ground beneath the wagon cracked open. A fissure split the cobblestone street, belching a deep crimson glow. From it came a sound, not of firewood snapping, but of bones grinding, countless bones crushed and reshaped by some invisible force. The villagers screamed and pulled away as the mayor was swallowed whole, his cry cut short in a chasm that sealed shut as though it had never existed. Panic surged. Some fled into the woods, others ran toward the river, but no matter which direction they chose, the fire followed. It licked the horizon, a living wall that hemmed them in. And then the bells rang, not the church bells, but the iron bells of the manor, bells that had not been touched for generations. Their toll rolled through the valley, slow and merciless, each strike echoing in the villagers' skulls. The children cried out, covering their ears, but the sound pressed through flesh and bone, vibrating deep in the marrow. One by one, the villagers realized the truth that could no longer be ignored. This was not a fire meant to destroy a house. It was a purge. And Margaret Hawthorne, whether spirit, flesh, or something in between, had chosen this night to reclaim what was hers. The valley had always been a place of safety, ringed by gentle hills and forests that shielded it from the outside world. But tonight, those hills became walls, their shadows stretching tall and jagged like the teeth of a trap. The villagers, clutching children, dragging carts, clutching what little they could, raced toward the northern pass. It was the only road that led out of Ashford Hollow. But the road was gone. Where once a winding dirt path had climbed between the rocks, now there stood a barricade of black flame. It did not dance or flicker, but burned as a solid curtain, heatless yet suffocating. A farmer hurled a stone through it, and the rock disintegrated into ash before it touched the ground. His wife clutched his arm, whispering prayers, but the sound of her voice seemed to vanish, swallowed by the fire. Others turned toward the woods. The elders swore there were hidden trails, long forgotten, paths the hunters once used. But when they entered the trees, they found no paths at all, only twisting trunks, endlessly repeating, bending in unnatural angles. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to coil back upon itself, spitting them out at the same clearing they had first stepped into. A group of men tried the river. They carried planks, hoping to lash together a raft and drift downstream until the valley released them. But when they reached the banks, they found the river no longer flowing. The water was still, black, reflective like a sheet of obsidian, and when one man touched it, ripples spread outward not in circles but in patterns, runes, symbols none could read. Before the water swallowed his hand up to the wrist, he screamed, thrashing, but the river held him like a jaw until another villager hacked through his arm to free him. The severed limb did not bleed, it smoked. At last they understood. There was no escape. The air was thick with the tolling of the manor bells, each strike louder than the last. With every toll, the valley itself seemed to shift. Trees bent, stones cracked, animals scattered in frenzied terror. The land they had called home was remaking itself into something unrecognizable. Children wept, asking why the sky was red, why the stars were gone, and the mothers shaking could only whisper, "It's her. She's not letting us leave." The people gathered in the square, not from choice, but from the pull of fear and inevitability. They huddled together, faces pale in the unnatural glow, waiting for something, an answer, a reprieve, a punishment. And then, from the burning manor at the heart of it all, the great doors opened. Margaret Hawthorne had stepped out. The manor doors groaned open with a sound like iron chains dragged across stone. The villagers froze, every cry silenced, every breath held. The glow of the fire inside poured out, spilling across the square like liquid light, casting long, trembling shadows. For a heartbeat, there was only silence, then the slow, deliberate strike of a cane against the steps. Thud, thud, thud. Margaret Hawthorne emerged. She did not stumble like a spectre, nor drift like a shade. She walked with the poise of the living, her gown untouched by ash though the flames licked at her heels. Her eyes, however, betrayed her, black as pitch, swallowing what little light remained. Her skin glistened, pale but marked with veins that pulsed faintly, as if carrying not blood, but something darker. Around her neck hung the same iron key the villagers had whispered about for generations, the key to the crypt beneath the manor, the key no one dared to touch. The crowd quivered. Some tried to avert their eyes, but the weight of her gaze dragged them back. It was not simply a stare, it was a tether, binding them to her will. "You thought you could run," she said, her voice low, rippling across the square like a breath of cold air. "You thought the hollow would release you, but the hollow is me. It has always been me." Her words slithered into their minds, bypassing ears, lodging deep like roots. A young mother clutched her child tighter, whispering prayers, but the baby began to scream, not from fear, but as though the sound of Margaret's voice had pierced its fragile body. An elder, trembling, dared to step forward. You were buried. We buried you." His voice cracked, his hands shaking with both terror and memory. Margaret smiled. It was not a smile of warmth or recognition, it was sharp, like glass. "Buried? You buried a body. You buried skin and bone. But I am not skin. I am not bone. I am what your fathers bargained for and what your mothers feared to name. I am the debt that was never paid." The bells struck again, and this time they did not sound like bells at all. They sounded like chains tightening, drawing shut. The villagers fell to their knees, not out of reverence, but because their bodies betrayed them. Muscles locked, spines bent, heads lowered. They could not resist. Margaret stood tall at the center of the square, her hands spread as if she were blessing them, but her voice carried only doom. "You are not free people of Ashford Hollow," she said, her eyes burning now with a crimson gleam. "You are mine. And tonight, the hollow is sealed." The flames of the manor surged higher, licking the sky, as if the earth itself obeyed her command. And the people finally understood. What had returned to them was not Margaret Hawthorne. It was something far older, wearing her face. The air thickened, heavy with heat and ash, though no one dared move. Margaret descended the steps of the manor, her cane tapping in rhythm with the villagers' thundering hearts. She moved slowly, savoring the paralysis in their bodies, the terror in their eyes. Each step tightened the invisible leash around their throats. Her gaze swept the crowd like a blade, searching, judging. The people dared not breathe until her eyes stopped upon the elder who had spoken, his frail hands clutching a rosary, knuckles bone white. His lips trembled with prayers, but the words withered before they could rise. "You remember," Margaret whispered, tilting her head. "You were there when they bound me. You heard the vows your fathers swore. You watched them betray me. It was you who sealed me beneath stone." The elder shook his head violently, tears streaking his face. "No, I was a child. I did not." His plea was cut short. With a flick of her cane, an unseen force yanked him from the crowd. His body lifted as if suspended by invisible hands, his legs thrashing, his rosary falling uselessly to the ground. The villagers cried out, but their voices broke against silence. They could not move, could not intervene. Margaret extended her palm. The elder drifted closer until he hovered before her, feet dangling above the earth. She leaned in, her black eyes gleaming. "The sins of the fathers are the inheritance of the children. Do you deny me what is owed?" He shook his head desperately, sputtering, "Please, God, forgive us." Margaret's smile widened, cruel and gleaming. "There is no God here, only the hollow." She pressed her hand against his chest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the elder convulsed violently, his body arching backward as a black vapor seeped from his mouth, his nose, even his eyes. The mist swirled in the air before sinking into Margaret's body, and she shuddered, as if drinking something sweet. The elder's skin shriveled, collapsing inward, until nothing remained but a husk, brittle and lifeless. The villagers wept silently, their knees trembling against the cobblestones. Margaret let the body drop, the sound of bones cracking echoing like a warning. She lifted her face to the sky, her voice thundering now, carried by the hollow itself. "One must fall so the rest may obey. Tonight begins the binding. Tonight the hollow is mine again." The ground beneath them rumbled faintly, as though the very soil recognized her dominion. The bells tolled once more, hollow and final, and every villager knew the truth. None of them would leave alive without offering something to Margaret. The first victim had been claimed, and it would not be the last. The elder's husk still lay at Margaret's feet, twisted and brittle like discarded parchment. The villagers dared not look at it, yet they could not look away. Every breath they drew tasted of ash and decay. Margaret raised her cane and struck it once against the cobblestones. The sound reverberated like thunder, sending shivers down their spines. The hollow itself seemed to vibrate with her command. "One life has been claimed," she declared, her voice echoing with unnatural depth. "But this is only the beginning. Each of you will give me an offering, a piece of your flesh, your blood, your kin. The hollow hungers, and I will not feed it alone." The villagers collapsed into cries of protest. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men clenched their fists, but could not summon courage to fight. Margaret watched, amused, her black eyes burning. "You will decide who is worthy to remain and who is to be given," she continued. "Choose now, or I will choose for you." The silence that followed was more suffocating than any scream. Then, like a sickness spreading through the crowd, whispers began. Eyes darted from one neighbor to another. Fear twisted into suspicion. Suspicion hardened into survival. "She is too old. Take her," a voice muttered. "No, no, he is weak. He cannot work the fields," another shouted. "Take the widow. She has no family to lose her." The villagers' desperation spilled into violence. They shoved one another, dragged trembling neighbors forward, each trying to deflect death away from themselves. Children cried as their parents screamed accusations into the night. The unity that had once bound them as a community fractured in an instant, replaced by primal betrayal. Margaret clapped her hands slowly, delighting in the chaos. "Yes," she whispered, "this is the truth of you. Strip away your faith, your civility, your masks, and all that remains is hunger for survival. You are no better than the men who buried me alive." One woman, sobbing uncontrollably, shoved her own brother forward. "Take him! Spare me!" Margaret tilted her head, savoring the betrayal. She extended her hand, and the man was ripped from the crowd, suspended like the elder before him. His screams pierced the night as the black mist bled from his body into hers. When he fell, another husk joined the ground at her feet. The villagers collapsed into wails, their faces pale and hollow, yet none dared to stop her. They knew the ritual would not end until Margaret herself decreed it, and with each soul consumed, she grew stronger, her veins glowing faintly, her shadow stretching unnaturally across the walls of the hollow. The offerings had begun, and before the night ended, the hollow itself would be drowned in betrayal. The night dragged on, hour by hour, until it felt as though the sun itself had abandoned the world. The hollow echoed with cries, with accusations, with the sound of neighbors dragging neighbors into Margaret's grasp. One by one, their bodies collapsed into withered husks, littering the cobblestones like offerings at a cursed altar. By the time dawn should have broken, no light touched the hollow. A pall of darkness clung overhead, thicker than storm clouds, pulsing with Margaret's power. She stood tall now, no longer a frail revenant. Her form, once skeletal, had swelled with stolen vitality. Her face, though still pale and ghastly, bore the faintest trace of youth restored, an obscene mockery of resurrection. The villagers who remained knelt, broken, their eyes wide with horror and defeat. They had betrayed their kin, and in doing so, they had surrendered their souls to her rule. The hollow was no longer a village, it was her dominion. Margaret raised her cane once more, striking the ground. The earth trembled, the very stones beneath their feet split, and black mist seeped upward, swallowing the streets, the homes, the chapel bell tower. Everything they had built, every memory, every grave of those who came before, they all vanished beneath a tide of living shadow. "This hollow is mine," Margaret declared. Her voice was no longer her own, but layered with 1,000 echoes, as though the souls she devoured now spoke through her. "It will stand as a monument to betrayal, a place where no light endures. Those who wander here will know despair. Those who resist will feed me." The villagers screamed as the mist climbed their bodies, searing their skin, branding them with marks of servitude. They were bound, no longer free men and women, but eternal thralls, souls tethered to Margaret's will. Their cries faded into silence as the hollow itself sealed shut, cut off from the world beyond. And then there was nothing. No birdsong, no wind, no trace of life. Only the sound of Margaret's cane tapping softly as she walked alone through the darkness she had claimed. Each step echoed as though the hollow itself bowed in obedience. From that night on, the hollow was erased from maps, forgotten in records, shunned in whispers. Travelers who stumbled too close vanished without a trace, their bones never found. And those who dared speak of it told the same tale, of a woman who had risen from the grave, demanding not prayers, but betrayal. Margaret had become more than a revenant. She was a curse, a shadow that would never die. And the hollow, her hollow, would never know the light of dawn again.